Hi, my name is Jules. This is Dchurched.com. This is the third part of an interview with Dr Greg Laughery from Switzerland. Hope you enjoy the program.
The deconstruction process is a necessary one for having a credible faith. And it could be a long kind of difficult time in someone's life, but I think, well, you're better to go through this because what you've had previously has not been worth holding on to. So things need to be rebuilt.
Let's deal in specifics. And you mentioned Genesis earlier on, and you've co-written a book on the early chapters of Genesis. What would you say to those who have a literalist approach to those and other narratives? Now, I recognize that you and I spent months and months and months, and you've written books on it as well. So you've spent years on the topic. So we're talking a 5-minute response to somebody who has a literalist point of view to Genesis. What would be your go-to line for that? I'm guessing the death discussion on death might come into it.
Yes, in our book From Evolution to Eden, we try to make a case for the early chapters of Genesis being stories, and a story in this context comprises several different characteristics or even genres of literature, and the two creation stories put side by side, at least in my opinion, by an editor at some later point. I think Israel probably had these two creation stories for quite some time, but whoever edited Genesis puts them together side by side. Although the two stories are in conflict, they really don't have very much in common if you read them closely. And so I think the literalist approach, again, in my view, would be further away from what's true about the text than closer to it. I think the story character is much stronger than a literal character. So
is that kind of applying your isness to it? Is that where you were going with that phrase, that you're applying the sense of what is to the text?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. That's part of it, because what we're trying to do is take the natural world into consideration, and the small amount we know about it today, and then read the text in light of that kind of informer. We call the natural world an informer and the Bible an informer, and these two informers are in tension.
If you go into Genesis as story stroke parable stroke poetry, how do you respond to those who I've come across quite often online and in person, who take it to the nth degree and say, well, how do we know that other parts of the Bible weren't just story, etc., etc.? And again, a secondary question is the classic ones are Jesus and Paul took these stories as literal. How do you respond to that? So that's really two questions in one then.
Yeah, well, the first one, I think, is, again, by genre. The early chapters of Genesis don't make, as far as I can see, any kind of historical claims. And the Gospels do. So I don't think you could lump together the Gospels in Genesis 1 through 3. They're very different character of literature, a very different genre of literature. So yeah, we borrowed this term historiography in our book. And historiography just simply means this writing down of events that took place once upon a time. But history is, say, for everything that happens in the world. So historiography does not equate history, and no text does in actuality.
Sure, absolutely.
So I think the Gospels are closer to, I don't know, what people might call real history, although they too are stories. They're more historical in character than Genesis 1 to 3. And then you have four of them, that are recounting similar yet kind of different views of, the life, death, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus. So John is very different from Matthew, but they do have some kind of core similarities. And again, Genesis, the two creation stories in Genesis, again, don't have very much in common at all. They're really quite different.
Mm.
So yeah, so I think this would be a good example of an absolutist kind of claim, that if you say this about that, then this means that over there. Well, it doesn't ring true. You could have very kinds of different, I think, for example, in the Old Testament, there's very, very conflicting views of the God of the Old Testament. So they don't all have the same views of God in the Old Testament writings, in the Hebrew Bible. So I think there's even interpretation going on there, and of course there's interpretation going on in the New Testament too. But let's face it, whoever wrote Genesis, or the two stories by two authors perhaps, is going back in what we call in the book the immemorial, which means a time before time. Listen, nobody was standing around with a pen and paper writing all this stuff down. So my kind of theory is these stories are probably a post-Exodus recounting that give a story of origins to the nation of Israel and its God. So they're put in place because you see some Exodus laws filtering into the creation stories, and you think, well, where did they come from? Well, they come from Exodus, no doubt. So they're kind of interwoven into the creation accounts. But yeah, I think that all national stories have these origin narratives, and Israel is no different, although their God is different.
So would you, given that it's tied into the rest of Genesis, one of the questions I've been asked in the past is, at what point does it become history? In the sense that this is a real character. I mean, obviously there's different views on this, but from your perspective. So is Abraham a real historical figure? Is Joseph, or can we go further back, and so on and so forth, or does the whole of Genesis become a particular genre of nation making myth?
Yeah, well, 12 and following in Genesis, I think, is more historical than less. And the first 11 chapters strike me as primeval history, the immemorial. This is time before time. So you could say, in some sense, a chronological time, which is historical time, kind of starts in chapter 12 with Abraham, which is also the history of the Jews, right? So that's kind of the history of the Jews. Then the creation accounts, to me, seem to be slotted in underneath this kind of historiographical account of Abraham and following out, and Israel becoming a nation, and so on and so forth. So I think, yeah, Abraham was probably, a figure like, I am in space and time, and existed. And whether all the things that are said about Abraham actually happen in exactly the way that they're said, I have no idea, because I have no access to the information that would put me in the notion of pure history. I don't have any access to pure history, and neither does anybody who's writing a history have access to pure history. It doesn't exist, because again, we're subjective. We're interpreters of the data. And as interpreters of the data, we can't see the data as completely objective. So the same kind of mediation applies to what I said earlier about subjective objectivity. Subjective objectivity is across the board. It's not just in areas of knowledge or reality. It's across the board for everything. If that what is closer to what's true, then it's an across the board. It's not reductionistic. It's more comprehensive without being total.
There's so many questions I could ask and talk to you about on this, but I think I will move on. Thank you, folks. You can buy Greg's book on Genesis and read in greater detail some of what he's sharing about his views of knowledge and of truth and how that works. Let me try and draw towards a last few questions or two, Greg, if I may, and just riff a little bit on Tom Wright here. In one place, you've made comment to the effect that my words, not yours, we cannot answer 21st century questions with 20th century apologetics. So just from your own observations, how do we understand faith differently to, say, 35 years ago when you and I spent 3 years together being drummed into being evangelicals? Well, no, it wasn't like that, actually, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think that if you take 20th century apologetics, and of course it's complicated because all apologists aren't exactly the same, but in general, if you take 20th century apologetics as being, let's say, more rationalistic, you used the term rationality earlier. I wanted to pick up on that a bit, but anyway, not to get off the point, but rationality or reason is important, but it's not certain. So I think 20th century apologetics was built largely on the sufficiency of reason, and that reason was trustworthy to give you absolute truth. And absolute truth then is objective, and it can be proved. So I've heard some apologists say that you can actually prove that God is there. You can prove that Christianity is true. And you can do so on the basis of the evidence and your reason. So I think that form, or that kind of category of 20th century apologetics is dead. It's not going to be persuasive because it's further away from the truth and closer to it, and people are going to see that.
It's interesting because, I mean, I used the phrase 35 years ago, and as you're talking, I'm remembering going out on the streets and doing evangelism as we used to do in the late 70s and early 80s, and you were armed to the teeth with your C.S. Lewis mad, bad, or God arguments, or other kinds of apologetics to defend the faith. And I'm talking to some punk rocker, the Mohican, the purple hair, the spikes coming out everywhere, and trying to justify there being a God to somebody who's going, yeah, so what? If I walked under a bus tomorrow, that kind of argument. If you walked under a bus tomorrow, what would happen to you? I mean, they just, for a start, they'd laugh their heads off at it because you say, well, I'll be splattered on the road, sort of thing, And but it didn't even cut the butter in my generation of young people.
No, you can't start with God. I think before we used to be able to start with God. I don't think you can do that. I don't think you could do it even then, but some apologists got away with it. But I don't think. Yeah, I think that what you've just described is spread out now. It's not just the punk rocker with the spiked purple hair. It's spread out. It's kind of all over the place, and people just again have this kind of have imbibed in this atmosphere of, so what? Who cares?
Yeah.
So you can't then start. You have to start somehow with them and where they're at, and this question that they throw back at you. Who cares?
Yeah.
So I think that's we have to start with them. We have to start with ourselves. Again, subjective objectivity. I have to start from myself. I can't. A lot of apologists have said, I start with God. I start with the biblical text.
Yeah.
My question is, how can you do that? How can you say that you're starting with the biblical text? You have to start with where you are and who you are in the world before you go anywhere. And so I think that the who cares question is more aligned with this. You have to start from where you are in the world. And then you go from there gradually, one step at a time, in embracing the subjectivity, but then moving in this direction of supplementing that subjectivity with objectivity. So I think the 20th century apologists often wanted to start with objectivity, or they wanted to start with God, who was objective, or the Bible, which was objective, and then reason. And, so I don't want to be irrational, but I don't want to be a rationalist either. So that comes back to these degrees. A degree of reason is appropriate, but once it passes a certain point, it becomes inappropriate. And because we're giving too much credibility to reason and not enough to faith. So maybe reason was very high on the scale in 20th century apologetics, but just can't be anymore because people don't give that weight to reason that they used to.
Yeah.
It's finding out from them, where they're coming from, and why they see themselves in the world. Forget about God for the moment. Why they see themselves in the world the way that they do, and then working with that and saying, oh yeah, I agree with how you see it there, but wait a minute, maybe there's more. Maybe you're being too reductionistic. Maybe there's more there. And so trying to open up possibilities is the way that I would say it, or yeah, open up directions, new directions that supplement what they already have. And then, maybe I've used these terms in books, before, of this kind of embrace and critique, which again is attention. So in your faith journey, or these people's faith journey, which it is, right? It's just not faith in God, but they have faith in something. So this faith journey, it's kind of embracing and critiquing at the same time. And it's that embrace and critique that you could even say in a Christian context is related to sanctification. So in the book Living Spirituality that I wrote, I don't know, some years back, quite a few years back, try to talk about this, the dynamic of sanctification that comprises these two dimensions of embrace and critique, or affirmation and critique. So there's things to affirm, but there's things to critique. And it's going to be that way until the end of our lives.
And for people who hear the word critique, you're not talking about embracing somebody and then criticizing them and telling them what's wrong with them.
No. It'd just be like critique of a critique of reductionism.
Oh, yeah. So that there is more to life than, and trying to notice that in there, or enable or journey with them into finding that. Is that what?
Yeah, it's trying, I think, to like I said earlier, have someone else see something for themselves, not to see it because you give it to them, but to see it for themselves in actuality. So it's an actuality for them subjectively, right? It's not mine, it's theirs. So it has to be their own. It has to be their own seeing. I can't see for them. I'm just trying to propose directions or possibilities that they might be able to see for themselves. So yeah, it's not being critical of the person. It's being critical more generally of what you might say a lack of isness, or a lack of being closer to what is than further away from it. So it's more that kind of a critique. But for a Christian, the affirmation and critique is related, you could say, to this sanctification process, if you could call it that, that's going on, hopefully in Christians' lives, and that comprises these two things. Another way of saying it would be sin and grace. That there's a tension between those two in our lives, and we don't rest comfortably in one or the other. Hence attention. And if sanctification is not attention, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, the now and the not yet.
Yes. Yeah. You could say in that light, in the biblical stories in the Gospels, Jesus kind of portrays his kingdom in exactly those terms. And what are those terms saying, though? It seems to me is that there is a tension here. Everything is not resolved now. Things are complicated and complex, and we're not going to figure everything out. So there's something, not nothing, and not everything. And the something leaves us in a tension in between. And theologically, the kingdom of God is exactly like that.
And it gets very messy, doesn't it? Because when you start to apply this to church and ecclesiology, and you start to think, what does it look like? What unifies us together as this particular group of people in this space and place and time? Excuse me. and then we want to embrace some levels of uncertainty. We want to not be dogmatic about any and everything, but at the same time, we also want to say there are some objective things that have been passed on to us historically as the people of God, some of which we hold a little bit more loosely perhaps, but what does that look like? So what might the truth claims of Jesus followers look like? Are there any?
Yeah, it's an excellent question and observation. Yeah, I think there are, but I think it's going to be a configuration between lots of a diversity of components or parts or pieces that go together, but not necessarily in an entirely cohesive way. So yeah, take the natural world informer and the biblical text informer. Well, there's going to be some truth claims in the natural world informer that Christians better wake up to and listen to and be aware of. And there are also claims in the biblical text informer that, like you just mentioned, the already and the not yet, in terms of the kingdom of God, and Jesus' death and resurrection and so on and so forth. So we may still have questions about these two informers, but that doesn't mean that we don't have any credible faith to embrace. And I think, yeah, that it's a process of kind of growing or building as we go along. Sometimes it's one step forward and two back. Other times it's two steps forward and one back. And it's so yeah, I do think that there is the scientific informer is giving us a lot of new information in the last 25 years, and I think that theists and Christians and religious people in general need to pay attention to that kind of information, and then take it seriously and look at their theistic Christian claims to truth, and kind of interact. Have those two informers interact, and then I'm not sure all the time where that's going to end up. Once you put these two informers together, I think there's sometimes going to be a clash, and other times there's not going to be. Just depends on what one's talking about.
And it gets very, very complicated. I think. The classic clash of what's true and what's not is on issues of sexuality in this day and age, and Christians vehemently disagreeing with one another, and people of good faith in both camps on, say, for example, the issue of homosexuality and some of those issues, and
even women's leadership in churches, and this is still I just come out with a ebook on 1 Corinthians 7. Living 1 Corinthians 7 with St. Paul, and this is a very complex chapter, and in the book I try to deal with the whole chapter, and talk about the cultural context in Corinth, and was Paul really as anti-women as some people make him out to be? And in the book I argue that's not the case, and for these and these reasons. But this is still an issue in many churches that you think, wow, what's holding people back? And so it's
but it becomes projecting into the church as it is, rather than as each of us would like it to be in our own image, sort of thing, or the image of our theology or my theology. It becomes a complex world to live with, that the old certainties of past. And here we are now, and we're trying to be together as a people of God. Do we or don't we recite the Apostles' Creed? Do we or don't we accept women into leadership? Do we or don't we marry gays in our church? And from a little bit of what you're saying, some of these matters we have to live with attention, and it's decidedly uncomfortable.
Yeah, and maybe that's the right place to be. If you're a theist and a Christian, maybe if you're not uncomfortable, you should be.
That's a too good a note not to end on, Greg. Tonight. I was going to say tonight, for our listeners. I'm here in Melbourne, and Greg's in Switzerland enjoying the snow while I'm baking hot here in Melbourne.
Well, thank you very much, Jules. It's been wonderful to be able to chat with you, and I appreciate very much what you're doing, and I'm supportive of your work, and just again really honored to be able to spend a bit of time going over some of these important matters, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Fantastic, Greg. You've been listening to Dchurched.com with my guest Greg Laughery. My name is Jules. If you would like to continue this conversation, please feel free to contact me at jules@dchurched.com. That's JOOLS at dchurched.com, or join us on our Facebook page by just typing in dchurched.com. Thanks for listening.